To find a military expedition which completely encapsulates the popular concept of the British Army in the 19th century, one need look no further than the Battle at Balaclava, fought in 1854 during the Crimean War. It is not hard to imagine young boys of the age listening wide-eyed to great tales of gallantry from the battlefield, their hearts stirring, eager for the day when they too would be old enough to take their place in Her Majesty's army and march proudly away to glory. The story of the Battle of Balaclava is filled with acts of heroic courage, typified by the brave victory against the odds of Sir Colin Campbell's Thin Red Line, and the dashing charge of the Heavy Brigade, led by the remarkable Sir James Scarlett. But it is the men of the Light Brigade and their valiant doom charge, immortalised in Tennyson's memorable poem, who are now part of British military folklore. Their story is an epic mix of incredible valour, terrible disaster, and the confused mystery surrounding Lord Raglan's fateful order to charge. The exact reasons for the war in the Crimea were deep-rooted, but lay principally in the British government's fear of Russian expansionism. Russia had long harboured designs on the Balkans in southeastern Europe, and her ambitious Tsar, Nicholas I, saw the crumbling of the Turkish Empire as a perfect opportunity to further press his claims. The capture of Constantinople would give Russia complete control over the entrance to the Black Sea from the Mediterranean through the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus. With an already secure and established naval base at Sevastopol, this would open the way for Russia's warships to the Mediterranean and afford her massive influence over foreign trade routes, particularly those of Britain and France. Not surprisingly, in the volatile political climate of the 1850s, these two countries were determined that a shift in the strategic balance should not be allowed to happen. It was only intense external pressure which had dissuaded Russia from her previous attempts to take control of the Balkans from Turkey. But Tsar Nicholas was a man not easily deterred. In 1852, he became embroiled in an argument with France over the key of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, then in Turkish territory. When the Sultan of Turkey decided the dispute in favour of Catholic France, the Tsar declared war on Turkey. Although this was ostensibly to protect the Orthodox religion, it was obvious to all that matters of faith were secondary to Russian territorial ambitions. Her first act of aggression was to invade Moldavia and Wallachia. The war was vigorously pursued by both sides, with many casualties. Still, this was not to be the last conflict between the two countries. It was for a benefit concert to aid the wounded of the 1877 conflict that Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky composed the famous Slavonic March, which is featured in this program. Britain was naturally alarmed, but recognized Russia as a determined and powerful enemy, and therefore acted with caution, limiting her involvement to naval patrols in the Black Sea. However, on the 30th of November 1853, the Russians attacked the Turkish fleet at anchor in the harbour of Sinope near Constantinople and destroyed it completely, with a loss of 4,000 Turkish lives. The British and French fleets arrived in time, only to rescue the few survivors from the wreckage. The reaction in Britain to the news was one of outrage, and in an instant a previously dispassionate press was demanding action. Government ministers were accused of obsequiousness and portrayed in the press as weak and indecisive. In particular, the press pilloried the Prime Minister, Lord Aberdeen. Punch in particular ran a fierce campaign against him, in which he was characterized as a tartan buffoon. The outcry in the press did its work. Suddenly, the whole public mood changed. Something had to be done to help poor beleaguered Turkey, the sick man of Europe. Unable to resist the enormous wave of public feeling, a still cautious British government demanded in an ultimatum to Russia on the 27th of February 1854 that her troops withdraw from Moldavia and Wallachia by the 30th of April, or the two countries would be at war. This stipulation for peace was contemptuously ignored by Tsar Nicholas. So having concluded a formal treaty of alliance with France, Britain set about building an army to defeat the Russians. Obviously, a full-scale war with a nation as vast as Russia was out of the question, and the War of 1854 was always seen as a short, sharp lesson to be handed out to the upstart Russians. Britain and France chose to concentrate on two fronts: a naval war in the Baltic, and on the areas where the main threat to their interests lay, the Crimea and the Russian bases at Sevastopol. This was not a straightforward task. Britain had enjoyed nearly 40 years without a major European conflict, and the long shadow of the Duke of Wellington still cast itself over the military. Wellington had died in 1852, and perhaps in an attempt to provide continuity, overall command of the British Expeditionary Force was given to Lord Raglan, the 66-year-old master of the Ordnance, and the Iron Duke's former military secretary. A veteran of Waterloo, where he lost his right arm, the Balaclava campaign was to be his first command of troops in battle. Raglan was given 5 infantry divisions, numbering 26,000 men. Of these 5 divisions, only one of the commanders who led them was under 60 years of age. The addition of 2 cavalry brigades brought the total army strength to 28,000. It was these same cavalry who would earn the campaign its special reputation, and it was among the ranks of the cavalry that the most interesting characters were to be found. The divisional commander of the cavalry was Lord Lucan, a hard-bitten, experienced cavalryman of 54 years, whose insistence on strict discipline made him extremely unpopular with officers and troops alike. He had no say in the choice of his 2 subordinates, and was mortified to learn that command of the Light Brigade of Cavalry had been entrusted to his brother-in-law, Lord Cardigan. These 2 men loathed each other, and made no attempt to conceal it. The acerbic and ill-tempered Cardigan had entered the army late, and had gained his first command through the system of purchase, under which an officer could buy his commission. This purchase system was even then held in disrepute, as his contemporary cartoon illustrates. Although brave beyond question, he had enjoyed a rather uneven military career thus far, and the Crimea was to prove no exception. Command of the other cavalry formation, the Heavy Brigade, was given to Brigadier General James Scarlett, a 55-year-old, and a man who was to fight with great distinction during the campaign.
British Army in 1854, of course, had not been involved in a major war since Waterloo. It's sometimes called the almost 40 years peace, 39 years of peace in fact. And this inevitably had had a considerable effect on its overall efficiency. Nothing to do with the courage of the men. There had been quite a few little colonial wars of one sort or another, and India, as always, had a series of campaigns. But in terms of the administration of the army and keeping it modernized, it was slightly, shall we say, behind the times. First of all, its numbers had been cut down so very considerably. By 1854, there was only something like 105,000 men in the British Army, and a lot of those were stationed in India and other stations. And it was a matter of great difficulty to get together an army of something like 26,000 men to form the Peninsular Expeditionary Force. We also had to accept that the influence of the great Duke of Wellington had not altogether been for the good in the long, long years since his most famous moment in 1815. He became ultra-conservative in his views and had been very much an opponent of suggested changes and reforms. And of course, he only dies in 1852, 2 years before the outset of this campaign. And of course, Lord Raglan is always saying on this campaign, what would the dear Duke have done when he has to make a decision? He's always trying to think back as to what his former great chief, how he would have tackled a particular problem. But probably the worst aspect of the army which fights in the Crimea in 1854 is its supply and logistical organisation.
From February 1854, troops left Britain for the Crimean Peninsula amid scenes of wild enthusiasm from an excited public, eager to send off Her Majesty's army with a rousing cheer. However, things started to go wrong almost immediately. After an agreeable stay in Malta, the British troops joined their French allies at Varna, in Turkish-held Bulgaria, bringing the total number of Allied soldiers crammed into the small, dirty, hot town to over 40,000. The men of both armies soon became bored and disillusioned as they awaited their orders in cramped insanitary conditions. To add to their woes, an outbreak of cholera swept through the ranks, carrying off 600 men in only a few days. But in August came news which should have signalled the end of the men's privations. Russia, alarmed at the massing of troops by Austria on its eastern border, withdrew from Moldavia and Wallachia, thereby complying with the terms of the British ultimatum. The war could and should have been averted. But the governments of Britain and France would have none of it. This was the jingoistic colonial age, after all. They had sent their soldiers to deliver a punitive blow against the Russians, and that was exactly what they intended them to do. Lord Aberdeen, in particular, was now a moving force in the continuation of the war. Fortified by continued public support for the war, Raglan was instructed to attack Sevastopol and destroy the Russian fleet. The likely achievement of these ambitious orders was not aided by the fact that no invasion plan actually existed. Furthermore, little or nothing was known of the Russian strength, and even less had been learned about the terrain over which the Allied armies were about to do battle. Raglan commanded an army now much reduced by disease and in very poor spirits. They would have to land in the Crimea totally lacking in logistical support. No tents, no hospitals, and no ambulances. Accordingly, a great deal of faith was placed in the increase of morale that leaving Bulgaria and the prospect of action would bring to the flagging spirits of the men. The Allies, 27,000 British, 30,000 French, and 7,000 Turks, landed unopposed at Kalamata Bay in the Crimea on the 14th of September 1854. But it was a full 5 days before the disembarkation was complete, and the Allied army could begin its march south towards Sevastopol, which lay 35 miles away. The very next day, the 20th of September, brought the first major engagement of the war in the Crimea. If Raglan had been surprised that the Kalamata Bay landings had met no opposition, he was soon to see the reason why. Ranged along the south bank of the River Alma lay the forbidding sight of the waiting Russian army, comprising 33,000 infantry and 3,400 cavalry, with 28 guns set in redoubts. It was commanded by His Highness Prince Alexander Menshikov, who had given the Tsar his personal assurance that the Allied advance would be checked, and the line at Alma held for at least 3 weeks, allowing time for the strengthening of the defences at Sevastopol. For the first time, the two great armies had sight of their enemy. The infantry of both sides were armed with a new Minié rifle, which had replaced the earlier flintlock muskets which had served the British Army since Waterloo. And though still muzzle-loaded, it was a far superior weapon. Accurate up to 800 yards, with 1 round in 16 taking effect, it compared very favourably with the 1 in 459 reportedly achieved by the old flintlock musket during the Peninsular War. The British in particular were to inflict great losses on tightly packed Russian positions, with 1 ball sometimes accounting for 2 or 3 men. The Battle of the Alma began with a French attack, commanded by General Canrobert, which, although wildly enthusiastic, achieved little. However, the British Light and 1st Divisions began to make steady progress, with the Coldstream and Grenadier Guards advancing in splendid order up the slope, shattering the Russian lines with their volleys of fire. To the west, the French forces managed to turn the Russians' left flank, and the Highland Brigade, brilliantly commanded by Sir Colin Campbell, routed the enemy right. It took just 1.5 hours for the Allies to complete a total victory, sending the day's Russians into retreat towards Sevastopol and winning the British Army its first major pitched battle in nearly 40 years. For many British soldiers, this was actually their first taste of battle, and all things considered, they had, without doubt, achieved a notable victory. The moment was recalled vividly by Lieutenant Colonel Somerset J. Gough Calthorpe, an officer on the headquarters staff who served throughout the campaign.
On the further heights, about a mile and a half from the Alma, the British troops ceased their pursuit. And then arose such a cheer from 20,000 victorious men. Even some poor wounded fellows joined in. I shall never forget that cheer as long as I live. I almost pitied the fallen enemy. It must have been so galling to them. I heard a man of the guards, pointing to some wounded Russians, say, "I say, Bill, pleasant for them poor devils, hearing our chaps cheer so." The men were tired, and many exhausted from lack of water. Lord Raglan rode up and down the line of troops, and the men cheered him vociferously. There was such a shaking of hands. One wrung the hand of a friend and said, "God bless you, old fellow. So glad to see you all right."
But the victory had not been achieved without cost. 362 men of the Army of the East lay dead on the field, with a further 1,600 wounded. The Russians, whose commanders had been amazed at British courage and discipline, sustained over 6,000 casualties. While the British took heart and rested, few could have known it, but there now came the turning point in the whole campaign. Lord Lucan, whose cavalry had not seen action at Alma, vigorously urged Raglan to send them in pursuit of the fleeing Russians, but Raglan refused.
The official reason which Lord Raglan gave for the failure to pursue immediately after the success at the riverline of the Alma was that his men were tired and that he had to give them 3 days' rest to catch up and reorganize and be prepared to advance again. But that doesn't wholly ring true. The cavalry under Lord Lucan had not been involved in the battle directly, and they were absolutely fresh. Indeed, Lord Lucan did press upon Lord Raglan the desirability of following behind the Russians there and then.
Lucan saw that there was a great opportunity to storm Sevastopol from the north, while the Russians were confused and unprepared. A bold, swift strike against a weakened enemy which must surely have brought complete victory. Instead, with the French in complete agreement, Raglan opted to circumnavigate Sevastopol and attack from the south. In so doing, he spurned a gilt-edged chance and opened the way for the grueling months of war that were soon to follow. The Russian garrison at Sevastopol, commanded by Admiral Kornilov, seized upon its good fortune and set about strengthening its defences, while Menshikov withdrew his army to the interior. The main priority for the British and French was to secure their lines of supply, which reached them by sea. So the Army of the East passed around Sevastopol towards the Chersonisy Plateau. Its objective, the two harbours, Kamiesh and Balaclava. If the troops were to be supplied from England and France, it was essential that they should quickly capture a safe deep water harbour. Balaclava was chosen as the target, and the harbour was secured by the British on September the 26th, after only token resistance from its defenders. With the port secure, the infantry moved on to the Chersonisy uplands to the south of Sevastopol, leaving the two cavalry divisions around Balaclava. Crucially, it was decided not to attack Sevastopol immediately. Canrobert and the French High Command insisted on a full artillery bombardment of the town before an attempt could be made, and Raglan, ever mindful of the need to maintain the strength of the Anglo-French alliance, once again concurred. But it took 8 days of back-breaking work to prepare the artillery batteries, time in which the Russian defences grew stronger as Allied morale weakened. Supplies had to be transported the 3 miles from the overcrowded harbour at Balaclava, and insurmountable supply difficulties meant no fruit or vegetables reached the troops, only salt beef and biscuits. Drinking water became contaminated, dysentery broke out, and most dangerously, there was again a few cases of cholera. Soon, hard work, sickness, and the cold Crimean nights had combined to shatter the euphoria of the victory at Alma. The infamous reputation of the campaign for the harshness of the climate and insanitary conditions were already beginning to establish itself. The war in the Crimea was the first conflict to be recorded by the newborn art of photography. The images seen here were shot late in the campaign and capture some of the misery which the British troops endured in that desolate landscape wrapped against the bitter cold, looking more like refugees than soldiers.
I must say, I never felt anything to equal the intensity of the cold. The nights became worse instead of improving. The wind was so high that it literally blinded one. It was with the greatest difficulty that I could make my horse face the storm. One was covered with cakes of ice. My beard and mustachio were frozen up into a sort of lump, and my eyes felt as if they would be sore for days to come. Altogether, I never remember having suffered so much from the severity of climate. What was worse, the French had over 1,200 cases of cholera. I'm told the troops die like rotten sheep, literally falling upon one another. It is believed by the French soldiers that many of their comrades were buried before they were actually dead, although doubtless they would have died within a few hours. Still, what a horrible idea, that the sick and dying should be hurried into eternity in so awful a manner.
With the siege works completed, the artillery began its bombardment on the 17th of October. But despite a week of shelling which wrought death and havoc to Sevastopol, the garrison would not yield. As the barrage failed to force the garrison into surrender, and the colder nights set in, living conditions in the Allied camps worsened. Frustration inevitably seized the troops, and morale plummeted. To add to the Allied problems, a new danger appeared. Intelligence reported that Menshikov's 25,000 Russian troops were massing in preparation for an attack on Balaclava. Unconvinced, Raglan was sceptical of the reports and made the fateful decision to disregard them totally, thus allowing the Russians the first advantage in the celebrated Battle of Balaclava on the 25th of October, 1854. The man responsible for the defence of the vital port at Balaclava was Sir Colin Campbell, an extremely able and experienced 62-year-old veteran of the Peninsular War and a commander of some repute. To secure its defence, a line of 6 redoubts had been constructed along the Causeway Heights to the north of the port, about 800 yards apart, and manned mostly by Turkish troops. 1,200 Royal Marines with 26 guns were placed on the eastern side of the Balaclava Gorge, and at the entrance to the gorge were ranged the 93rd Highlanders, W Battery Royal Artillery, and a battalion of Turks. The nearest cavalry was half a mile to the south under the command of Lord Lucan. The Russians had done their homework well. They realized that the nearest infantry reinforcements available to Campbell were on the Chersoneset Plateau, perhaps 2 hours away. Menshikov planned a massive attack on the redoubts from the west, sending a total of 25 battalions and 78 guns under the command of General Liprandi to seize the position. 3 more columns were to assault from the east, whilst further infantry and cavalry lay in reserve to the north in the North Valley and Fedokini Hills. Although Raglan remained unconvinced of a potential attack on the redoubts, Lucan, in command of the cavalry, was much more concerned. He and Campbell had established a reasonable working relationship, which brought a measure of welcome cooperation between infantry and cavalry. Lucan's concern led to daily stand-tos for the cavalry at dawn, and thus, as the first Russian shells hit No. 1 redoubt on the 25th of October, they at least were prepared to ride to the aid of the infantry if required. With surprise on their side, the Russians quickly overran the redoubts. The Allied cavalry in support sustained a large number of casualties, and by 7:30 a.m. the situation had become hopeless. The Russians now controlled all of the redoubts along the Causeway Heights. It was then that Raglan appeared on the scene, and after surveying the battlefield from the eastern escarpment, sent orders to the 1st and 4th Divisions of Infantry to march in support of Sir Colin Campbell. He also ordered Lucan with his cavalry to withdraw to the south of the last redoubts. where they could be protected by artillery fire from the surrounding hills. Lucan was less than pleased to receive Raglan's instruction. It left the 93rd Highlanders, only 550 strong, positioned on a small ridge north of Kadikaioe, between the Russians and the entrance to the Balaclava Gorge. Sir Colin Campbell, alert to the danger of the situation, managed to augment his meagre troops with 40 sick or wounded guardsmen, plus a few Turks from the redoubts and the artillery of W Battery. Before long, the Russian guns from the captured redoubts began to find their range, so Campbell ordered the 93rd to form up on the reverse slope of the ridge. No sooner had this been done than a great many of the Turks lost their nerve and fled towards Balaclava, leaving the remaining men of the 93rd Highlanders awaiting the appearance of their enemy. They were not long in coming. 4 eager squadrons of Rysov's hussars soon galloped down the North Valley between captured redoubts 4 and 5, directly towards Campbell's 93rd. Campbell formed his men into 2 ranks, still on the reverse side of the slope, ignoring the usual square formation. And as the Russian cavalry thundered towards them, he had his 2 lines of men make a sudden, dramatic appearance at the crest of the ridge. The splendid Campbell rode along the line, calling to his troops, "Remember, there's no retreat from here, men! You must die where you stand!" The charging hussars were stunned by the 93rd's sudden appearance from beyond the ridge and by their unusual formation. Unsure of how to react, their charge began to falter. With the impetuous bravery which has characterized the Scottish fighting men over the centuries, some men from the ranks of the 93rd instinctively began to edge towards their foe, but Campbell knew this would be fatal. 93rd! 93rd! Damn all that eagerness! Regaining their composure, the Russian cavalry charged on, and as they came within range, the order came to fire. The first volley caused havoc in the ranks of the hussars, although not enough to halt the charge. At 250 yards range, a second volley tore into the cavalry, and they wheeled to their left in confusion. A third volley into their right flank sent the hussars into full retreat towards the causeway heights, harassed by the artillery of W Battery and taunted by the ringing cheers of the 93rd Highlanders. Their heroic stand would be known forever as the Thin Red Line.
Discipline and courage have always been major factors in the history of the British infantry engaged in a campaign, and that was just as true in the Victorian era as it had been in that of the great Duke of Wellington and the wars against Napoleon. In many ways, there was a sense of having inherited the traditions of the Peninsula and of the Waterloo campaign in these regiments, and they were famed for their great discipline when it came to the matter of the firefight, taking the orders of the officers to fire rather than shooting off as soon as they thought they were within range. They were drawn up, of course, in this famous double line, which goes down in history as the Thin Red Line, but the first actual mention of it in this particular operation refers to the Thin Red Streak, which I think gives an even better idea about how thinly stretched they were to cover the front of this quite imposing Russian cavalry attack which was coming in.
Lord Raglan watched the superb performance of Campbell's 93rd from his position above the battlefield. Expecting them to be overrun, he had ordered Lucan to send cavalry support to Campbell, and Lucan therefore ordered Sir James Scarlett to detach 8 squadrons from his heavy brigade and ride towards Kadikaioe. In doing so, he paved the way for another of the morning's glorious actions. Scarlett was a large, popular man who had never before seen battle, but had been prudent enough to surround himself with the experienced Lieutenant Elliot, his ADC, and Colonel Beaton, who acted in an advisory capacity. Scarlett, as ordered, moved off from the foot of the Sapperline Ridge towards Kadikaioe with his 8 squadrons, including the 1st and 2nd Squadron in his Killings, 4th and 5th Dragoons Guards, the Scots Greys, and the Royals. Their advance took them to the south of the hastily struck Light Brigade camp, vacated only a few hours earlier and past a large vineyard. It was here that Scarlett first saw what must have been an unexpected sight. The remainder of Rysov's cavalry, all 19 squadrons of them, who had left the North Valley and were heading directly towards them. Scarlett realized at once that it would be impossible to get all of his 8 squadrons into formation, for some had not cleared the camp or the vineyard. Roaring the order, "Left wheel into line!" the 2nd Inniskillings, 1st and 2nd Greys, and the 5th Dragoon Guards formed up into 2 lines, while Scarlett and his officers coolly directed operations with their backs turned on the Russian advance. As with the 4 squadrons of hussars who had attacked the thin red line, confusion appeared to beset the Russian charge at the crucial moment, and inexplicably Rysov halted his 2,000 cavalry only 100 yards from Scarlett. If he felt the need to redeploy his men in the face of Scarlett's line, he had badly underestimated the time available to him and the British strength of will. Whatever his reason, it gave Scarlett the breathing space he needed and afforded him the completely unexpected opportunity to engage a stationary, if numerically superior, enemy. Finally, Scarlett shouted his order. "Alignment advance! At a walk!" and bade his trumpeter to sound trot, gallop, and charge! This was to be the famous charge of the Heavy Brigade. Scarlett, Elliot, the trumpeter, and Scarlett's huge orderly, Shegog, was first to the Russians, at least 50 or 60 yards ahead of the Inniskillings and the Scots Greys. The remarkable Brigadier General was soon deep inside the Russian ranks, thrusting and slicing with his sword. Within seconds, the brass-hatted Inniskillings and the bearskin Scots Greys joined in the frantic fight for life. Corporal Goff of the Inniskillings remembered the scene.
My horse fell and got up again, and I was entangled in the saddle with my head and one of my legs on the ground. He tried to gallop on, but fell again, but I managed to get loose. A Russian Cossack was going to run me through, but McNamara came up and nearly severed his head from his body, so thank God I didn't get a scratch. I grabbed a riderless horse, whereupon a Russian rode up. I'd seen a pistol in the hoisted pipe, so I shot him in the arm. He dropped his sword, and I immediately ran him through the body. But poor Captain Neville fell from his horse and was wounded while there. He had 1 large wound and 3 others in the back. He lay still, with his face to the ground, until, thinking that they were gone, raised his head to look when a Russian dismounted and cut him with the sword over his head. His helmet saved his scalp, but his right ear was cut into. As some cavalry rode over him, and he felt dreadfully hurt by the horse's hooves. Private Abbott dismounted. I lifted him from the ground and finally made him stand, and ended finally by dragging him by bodily strength to a place of safety.
The terrible melee continued, with the tightly packed British heavies and Russian hussars slashing at each other at the closest possible quarter. Incredibly, only 10 minutes after Scarlett had crashed into the Russian ranks, the 5 squadrons of British cavalry, just 500 strong, had gained the ascendancy over the 2,000 Russians, and their formation began to crumble. A final assault on their right flank by the 4th Dragoon Guards was decisive, and the Russians began a disorderly retreat towards the Causeway Heights. In the whole action, the Heavy Brigade had sustained 78 casualties, the Russians 270. The amazing Sir James Scarlett had 5 wounds to his body, his ADC Elliot 14. Both were classified as lightly wounded. A French general who observed the whole action was moved to observe, "The victory of the Heavy Brigade was the most glorious thing I ever saw." Sir Colin Campbell, his 93rd Highlanders cheering behind him, "Greys! Gallant Greys! I am 62 years old, and if I were young again, I should be proud to be in your ranks." So the British had won a tremendous second victory in the developing Battle of Balaclava. Spirits were high, and the Russians were in some disarray. Surely none could have foreseen the disaster that less than 2 hours hence would befall the unfortunate Light Brigade. Rysov withdrew his confused and battered cavalry to the relative safety of the North Valley's eastern end, where they joined the 8 guns of the 3rd Don Cossack field battery. In close proximity were a further 22 Russian guns, making a formidable 30 pieces of artillery ranged on 3 sides of the valley. It was to be 90 long minutes before the first moves were made to engage them, time in which they took stock of the situation and reorganized their ranks, time which proved fatal for the Light Brigade. Raglan was desperate to take advantage of Scarlett's victory with his heavy brigade, but he was frustrated in his plans by the painfully slow progress of the infantry divisions, originally ordered onto the plain to support the 93rd Highlanders. Raglan had intended the infantry to join with the cavalry and recapture the redoubts, still occupied by the Russians. But he eventually lost patience, and at 10:15 a.m. sent the order to Lucan, "Cavalry to advance and take advantage of any opportunity to recover the heights. They will be supported by the infantry, which has been ordered to advance on 2 fronts." It was now that confusion and uncertainty began to take a grip on proceedings. Lucan formed up the light and heavy brigades at the west end of the North Valley, between the Fedekini Hills and the Causeway Heights. He now expected to be ordered against the Russians, who had been previously defeated by the heavy brigade. But with the additional guns, the Russians were now in well-prepared positions and could not be attacked without infantry support. What Lucan could not see, however, owing to the undulation of the terrain, was Russian artillery attempting to carry away guns from the redoubts on the Causeway Heights. Carrying off the guns traditionally marked a victory in battle, and it was against these men that Raglan expected Lucan to attack. While Raglan from his position could clearly observe the situation, Lucan was completely unaware of the fate of the guns and stayed still while he awaited the arrival of the infantry he needed to move against his objective. Raglan became very annoyed with Lucan, who still waited in the North Valley while the guns were still being taken away. Why had Lucan not advanced in response to his earlier order? What on earth was going on? The tragedy of the Light Brigade was about to be played out. With typical Victorian regard for the correct form, Calthorpe recalled the events of the day.
It now becomes my task to record the sad catastrophe of the day. If gallantry, courage, and daring can compensate in any way for the noble lives that were sacrificed, we have every reason to be proud of the chivalry displayed. Indeed, I question whether we can look upon it as a disaster when we consider the impression that noble little band made upon the foe. Although the result was not that of victory, still it will be remembered as brilliant proof of how little our troops consider the odds opposed to them when duty points the way.
Raglan called forward the noted horseman, Captain Edward Nolan, a man with an uneven temper and excitable nature, and issued him with his second order to be delivered to Lucan. "Lord Raglan wishes the cavalry to advance rapidly to the front and try to prevent the enemy carrying away the guns. Troop of horse artillery may accompany. French cavalry is on your left." It was Raglan's unfortunate decision to entrust Nolan with the order which directly led to the disaster which was to follow. Nolan held Lucan in contempt and had been fiercely critical in private of both the man and his cavalry during the campaign thus far. Nolan now had the perfect opportunity to compel Lucan to behave in the manner he believed befitting of a British commander. Lucan, who could not see the guns being carried away, received the order with a mixture of bewilderment and deep concern, as to all intents and purposes he was being ordered to charge formed artillery head-on, and insisted Nolan return to clarify the command. Nolan replied, "Lord Raglan's orders are that the cavalry should attack immediately," to which Lucan snapped, "Attack, sir? Attack what? What guns, sir?" Lucan, of course, was justified in his uncertainty. He had not seen and could not see the guns in the redoubts on the Causeway Heights. But by now Nolan was in a state of high excitement, and with mounting insubordination he thrust his arm out in the direction of the guns, awaiting in excellent position at the end of the North Valley. The wrong valley. "There, my lord, is your enemy! There are your guns!" Lucan, possibly flustered by the confusion and Nolan's highly disconcerting manner, made the fatal decision to attack the guns at the end of the North Valley, the 3rd Don's Cossack battery, and not the guns being carried off from the redoubts on the Causeway Heights. He rode over to his hated brother-in-law, Lord Cardigan, and informed him of his decision. Cardigan tersely pointed out that a battery of guns on 3 sides awaited them, to which Lucan replied, "I know it, but Lord Raglan will have it, and we have no choice but to obey." Tragically, the hatred between the two men was so intense that they found it impossible to communicate further. Rational discussion was out of the question. There was therefore no attempt to rectify the order. Cardigan merely turned away with the words, "Here goes the last of the Broodnulls." And so, after Lucan had issued a stern warning against undue haste, Cardigan gave his order. "The brigade will advance!" The 3 lines of the Light Brigade began to ride slowly down the valley. Behind them, and to their right, were Lucan and Scarlet and the Heavy Brigade. Despite Lucan's exhortation to maintain a walk, the 600 men of the Light Brigade soon began to trot, leaving the Heavies some way behind. It was then a famous and dramatic scene occurred. Captain Nolan, who had sought and been granted permission to ride with the 17th Lancers in the Light Brigade, suddenly galloped forward ahead of Cardigan, yelling frantically and waving his sabre. Had he at last realized that Cardigan and his cavalry were about to attack the wrong guns? Was Nolan's extraordinary behavior a desperate attempt to redirect the charge away from the waiting Cossack battery and towards the redoubts on the Causeway Heights? History will never know. For as Nolan surged forward, he was shot through the chest, therefore becoming the first fatality of the charge.
Nolan was the first man killed. Some grape shot hit him in the chest. His horse turned and carried him to the rear through our advancing squadrons. His screams were heard far above the battle, and he fell dead from his saddle near the spot where the order had been given for the charge. The pace of our cavalry increased every moment, until they went thundering along the valley, making the ground tremble beneath them. The awful slaughter that was going on from the fire the enemy poured into them apparently did not check their career. On they went, headlong to the death, disregarding aught but the subject of their attack.
Behind the smoke and dust of the Light Brigade, Lord Lucan and the Heavies were struggling to keep up. Before long, a dangerous gap had opened up between the two brigades, and Lucan was faced with an agonizing decision. Should he press on and try to join the Light Brigade, which he could see being cut to ribbons before him, or should he halt, cut his losses, and cover their inevitable retreat down the North Valley? Lucan could see little point in continuing, and so ordered the Heavy Brigade to halt, shouting, "They have sacrificed the Light Brigade! They shall not have the Heavy if I can help it!" Meanwhile, the Light Brigade, with Lord Cardigan at its head, sword ever at the slope, continued to display the dauntless courage and discipline which were to be the fame of every Victorian army. They were at the centre of a storm of cannon and grape shot, which tore into their charging ranks, leaving the air filled with the terrible screams of dying men and maimed and terrified horses. The first line was only 100 yards from the Russian guns when they loosed off a final dreadful volley of grape shot, which ripped the line asunder, leaving only 150 men remaining on horseback. Incredibly, Lord Cardigan was among them, and he rode almost contemptuously between the guns before coming face to face with the Russian cavalry waiting behind the artillery. Cardigan, his objective reached, his duty done, wheeled his horse around and cantered back up the valley. No sooner had the Light Brigade's fortunate survivors arrived at the guns than they were faced with a further desperate battle for life, as the waiting Russian Cossacks fell upon them, yelling wildly. Bravely the Light Brigade fought on, sabring the gunners. A series of bitter hand-to-hand fights ensued. A sword met lance. Men were run through, and heads and limbs were hacked and severed.
As soon as the Russians saw that all our squadrons had arrived at the guns, they sent a large body of lancers to cut off our retreat. Colonel Shelwell at once ordered the 8th Hussars to wheel about and charge, and was himself first to enter the Russian lancers. They offered but feeble resistance. Then the 8th passed through them at 4 times their strength, cutting down all in their way, while the remainder dispersed to right and left. A way was thus clear for the remainder of our cavalry to retire unopposed, but not unmolested, as the enemy opened upon them with grape from both sides, which combined fire made fearful havoc of the gallant remnant of the Light Brigade. 2 squadrons of the Chasseurs d'Afrique made a brilliant attack on the Russian battery to their left front, silencing several guns, and retiring only under overwhelming fire from the Russian infantry. It was a daring act, and one well worthy of their reputed élan. The losses our light cavalry sustained in this splendid but unfortunate charge were very great.
The shattered remains of the Light Brigade returned in battered and bleeding groups down the North Valley. Lord Cardigan, ever the military man, sought out Lucan to complain bitterly about the behaviour of Captain Nolan. He then drew up what was left of his exhausted command. Men, it's a mad-brain trick. It is no fault of mine. The recriminations began almost instantly. Raglan, unable to believe what he had witnessed, remonstrated with Cardigan. What do you mean, sir? By attacking a battery contrary to all the usages of warfare and the customs of the service? My lord, I hope you will not blame me, for I received the order to attack from my superior officer in front of the troops, came Cardigan's answer with an accusing gesture towards Lucan. Sir, said Raglan quietly, you have lost the Light Brigade. The charge of the Light Brigade lasted approximately 25 minutes and covered a distance of 1.25 miles. 673 men started out on that doomed journey towards the guns, the finest brigade of light cavalry Britain could muster, and all desperate to see action. When it was over, the brigade could boast only 195 fully fit men. 113 lay dead in the valley, and 247 more were badly wounded, unable to bear arms. 475 horses had been killed, with a further 42 injured. The Light Brigade had paid a terrible price for its ride to glory. A day that had started so well for the British had ended in disaster. The Russians had all but destroyed the Light Brigade, and they had captured the guns from the redoubts. They still held part of the Causeway Heights. The British were left to reflect on a series of missed opportunities and misunderstandings.
In the first place, the outcome of the Battle of Balaclava was that it denied the Russians their objective in making the attack, which was, of course, to attack the port of Balaclava, destroy our bases and supply lines, and thereby make our position on the camps facing Sebastopol untenable. Strategically, you can't say it had a very great effect at all. The campaign in the peninsula was going to drag on to the following September before Sebastopol itself was actually evacuated by the Russians and the war begins to move to its conclusion. But of course, the reason why it enters so much folklore is that it contains no less than 3 major episodes which the British people identified with immediately after they had reports of the battle, and which have become part of our sort of national myth ever since.
What if Raglan had pressed home his advantage after the Battle of Alma? If he had taken more seriously the reports of the intended Russian attack on the redoubts at Balaclava? If Cardigan had pursued the fleeing Russian cavalry after the charge of the Heavy Brigade? And perhaps, most crucially of all, had there not occurred the tragic confusion which sent the Light Brigade on its infamous mission of death? These questions will forever remain unanswered. But they did at least leave an everlasting testimony to the courage and bravery of a gallant 600. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them, volleyed and thundered. Stormed at with shot and shell, boldly they rode and well, into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell, rode the 600.